I was 48 when I realized something was wrong. But it didn't happen all at once. There was no explosion, no scandal, no public fall. It was quieter than that. A slow erosion, the kind you only notice after the original shape is already gone. Until then, I believed clarity was a virtue, that explaining things well prevented conflict, that those who made themselves understood were not attacked. I spoke too much because I thought I was being responsible. At the time, I held a position high enough to be visible, but not high enough to be untouchable. Long meetings, ambiguous decisions, ego games disguised as professionalism. Whenever something went wrong, I felt an immediate need to add context. I explained before anyone asked. I justified myself before anyone accused. I believed that anticipating judgment would protect me from it. I remember one meeting in particular, a small mistake, something that could be fixed in minutes. Before anyone said a word, I was already talking. I listed factors, processes, external failures. I made everything sound logical, rational, irrefutable. When I finished, the room fell silent. It wasn't approval, it was something else. A strange silence, uncomfortable, as if I had just confessed to something no one had asked. After that, the changes began quietly. Side comments, glances that lingered half a second too long. People who used to explain their decisions now merely announced them. I was still heard but no longer consulted, still present but no longer central. At the time, I didn't connect one thing to the other. I kept explaining. The more unstable the ground felt beneath me, the more words I piled on top of it. The more distance I sensed, the harder I tried to build bridges out of sentences. Until the day I understood the obvious far too late. No one had asked me to explain myself. I was offering voluntary submission. That's when I realized they weren't attacking me. They were observing, and every time I explained myself, I confirmed something I should never have admitted, that I believed I needed their permission to exist in that room. So I spoke, adjusted my words, tried to align perceptions. I thought I was containing damage, when in truth I was creating a pattern. People learned quickly. All it took was a vague insinuation and a pause. I did the rest on my own. An offhand comment about deadlines, a sideways look, a question left too open. I would slip into automatic explanation mode, not because I was guilty, but because I wanted to make sure no one misunderstood. That was how I justified it to myself. Over time, I noticed that others explained nothing. They made mistakes, corrected them, and moved on. They gave no context. They didn't narrate intentions. They didn't defend themselves. They acted as if no courtroom existed at all. Meanwhile, I behaved as though I were constantly giving testimony. There was one episode that made everything clear. A colleague twisted one of my decisions in front of the board. He didn't lie outright. He simply rearranged the facts. When I had the chance to speak, I did what I always did. I rebuilt the entire timeline, demonstrated good faith, was precise. When I finished, he only said, "I understand." Nothing more. The following week, the project was transferred to him. It wasn't an explicit betrayal. It was something colder, more refined. He didn't need to attack me. He simply let me expose myself. My explanations had done the dirty work for him. In trying to prove I wasn't wrong, I had implicitly accepted that maybe I was. That was the moment something began to crack inside me. It wasn't anger, it was clarity. I realized that every time I explained myself, I shifted the center of power outward. I wasn't defending decisions, I was asking for absolution. And anyone who asks for absolution has already lost the trial. After that, I began to observe in silence. Not like someone planning revenge, but like someone who had finally realized he was playing a game without knowing the rules. I started paying attention to those who spoke little, not the timid ones, but the strategic ones. People who answered only what was asked, who never added unnecessary details, who didn't rush to correct misinterpretations. I noticed something unsettling. The less they explained, the less they were questioned. No one demanded justification from those who appeared to own nothing. Meanwhile, those who hurried to clarify everything, myself included, became fertile ground for doubt, requests, suspicion. Explanation always generated more questions. Always. I began to understand that it wasn't about communication. It was about psychological hierarchy. The one who explains takes the lower position, often without realizing it. To explain is to react. To react is to accept the other person's frame, and whoever defines the frame determines who stands above. I remembered how many times I had tried to clear up misunderstandings that existed only because someone had created them. People who launched vague phrases on purpose. Some people found it strange. There were comments. Maybe you should clarify. Nothing concrete. No direct accusation, just smoke. And I, as always, rushed to extinguish a fire that didn't even exist. By doing that, I legitimized the smoke. I began testing small changes. Nothing theatrical, nothing aggressive. When insinuations appeared, I no longer rushed to provide the full context. I answered briefly. Sometimes I simply confirmed a fact. Other times I stayed silent. The discomfort was physical. My body begged me to explain. My mind screamed that I was being misunderstood. But something curious happened. People started explaining themselves to me. They returned with extra sentences, tried to adjust what they had said, reshaped accusations into questions. Some even laughed, as if trying to soften the initial attack. It was as though the weight had shifted positions. The void that once terrified me now unsettled the person on the other side. That was when I understood a hard truth. Most conflicts do not seek clarification. They seek submission. The attacker wants to see you move, wants reaction, wants effort. When you don't provide that, the attack loses its function. Not because you won, but because the game requires two players. And I had stopped playing. The real turning point came a few months later. It wasn't during a major argument or an open confrontation. It happened in a small meeting, almost insignificant, the kind that usually leaves no trace. A manager mentioned my name casually and said I had delayed a delivery. It wasn't true. The delay came from another department. Before, I would have opened the spreadsheet, explained the workflow, shown emails, reconstructed the entire timeline. This time, I did none of that. I looked at him and said only, "Noted." Nothing else. The silence that followed was uncomfortable. Someone cleared their throat, another person checked their phone. The manager tried to continue but stumbled over his own words. He felt the absence of my defense. Without it, the accusation hung in the air, unsupported. 2 days later, I received a private message. He wanted to better align what had been said. It came with explanations, justifications, almost an apology. That was when I understood something essential. An accusation depends on your reaction to validate the attack. Without reaction, the accusation rots on its own. From that point on, I began to see patterns. People who once spoke with excessive confidence started choosing their words carefully around me. Side comments disappeared. Questions stopped coming with a tone of demand. I hadn't changed my position or my role. I had removed only one thing: the habit of defending myself. It wasn't coldness, it was energy economy. I realized that explaining too much creates a record against you. Every detail becomes reusable material. Every sentence can be distorted later. The more you speak, the more ammunition you provide. Silence, on the other hand, leaves no traces. It cannot be quoted out of context. It cannot be edited. It cannot be used against you. During that period, I began to understand why certain men seemed untouchable within institutions. They weren't more competent, nor more ethical. They had simply learned not to place themselves in the position of the accused. They never defended themselves. And because of that, no one dared accuse them anymore. After that, Something changed in the way people behaved around me. It wasn't immediate and it wasn't announced, it was subtle. Conversations stopped when I approached. Jokes came out half finished. Questions stopped being provocative and became purely objective. Not because I had become hostile, but because I had stopped being predictable. Before, everyone knew exactly how I would react. I would explain, organize the facts, try to be fair, try to be understood. That made me safe for others and vulnerable for myself. When I stopped explaining, I broke that invisible contract. There was resistance. Some people tested the boundaries. One colleague implied publicly that I had become difficult. Another said I seemed arrogant. Before, I would have corrected them. I would have said that wasn't it, that I was just focused, that nothing was personal. This time, I simply listened. I neither confirmed nor denied it. The discomfort shifted to their side. I discovered something unsettling. Most provocations don't seek truth. They seek emotional access. When you don't react, the conversation dies. There is no spectacle, no exchange, only emptiness. And emptiness deeply unsettles those who live on friction. Over time, I noticed that conflicts began happening without me. My name came up less. My decisions stopped being questioned. Not because everyone agreed, but because they realized questioning produced no return. There was no stage. It was during that period that I understood the real cost of speaking too much. It wasn't just exhaustion. It was loss of position. Every explanation placed me lower, justifying myself before someone who had never earned that right. Silence was not submission. It was refusal. Refusal to participate in games that led nowhere. Refusal to turn my life into public debate. Refusal to negotiate my emotional stability. Curiously, the less I said, the more weight my words began to carry. When I spoke, people listened, because they knew I spoke only when it was necessary. Excessive voice trivializes a man. Restraint defines him. It wasn't a moral victory. It was strategic. And for the first time, I began to feel something rare in that environment. Respect without negotiation. With respect came something I didn't expect. Solitude. Not the sad kind, but the quiet one. When you stop explaining yourself, you also stop being invited into certain kinds of intimacy. People like those who open themselves too much, who justify themselves, who ask to be understood. That creates connection, but it also creates hierarchy. By refusing that role, I made myself emotionally inaccessible. Some drifted away. Others changed their tone. There were fewer confidences, fewer attempts at closeness disguised as curiosity. At first, I thought I had done something wrong. I felt tempted to return to the old habit, to soften my presence with unnecessary words. But I watched more carefully. I noticed that the ones who pulled away were exactly those who benefited most from my constant explanations. People who tested limits, threw vague accusations, created noise just to measure reaction. Without reaction, they lost interest. Silence works like a cruel filter. It doesn't bring people closer, it selects. I began to see how many relationships are sustained by small emotional intrusions, questions that don't seek answers, only power, sideways remarks meant to provoke correction, subtle judgments waiting for defense. When you explain, you step in. When you don't, the door stays closed. At work, this changed everything. Meetings became shorter, arguments diminished. When people disagreed with me, they had to bring facts, not assumptions. There was no longer space for emotional attacks. In my personal life, it was harder. There were long silences, unresolved misunderstandings, people who chose to believe incorrect versions rather than ask directly. I accepted it. I learned that being understood by everyone requires constant exposure, and constant exposure demands a price too high over time. Not explaining myself didn't make me cold. It made me inaccessible to chaos. I began sleeping better. I thought less about the day's conversations. I stopped replaying sentences, stopped imagining better replies. The internal theater went quiet. That's when I understood. Explaining yourself isn't communication. Often, it's anxiety in disguise. And abandoning that impulse doesn't make you lose important people. It simply reveals who never truly was. Today, I am 52 years old. I don't say that with pride or with weight. I say it the way you mark a position in time. I've lived long enough to know that almost nothing truly changes after a certain age. It only reveals itself. I am still judged. People still talk about me. They still construct versions of me that I don't control. The difference is that I no longer feel the need to correct them. I learned that truth does not need to be defended when it is sustained by behavior over time. Those who demand constant explanations are not confused. They are testing authority. The world didn't change when I stopped explaining myself. I changed my position within it. I stepped out of the defendant's chair. I stopped arguing narrative. I let facts do the slow work that words never do properly. Some still try. They throw vague accusations, sideways comments, loaded questions. They wait for the old reflex. They get nothing. A neutral look, an "I understand," sometimes not even that. And the attack dies where it was born. Over time, I realized something harder to accept. No one respects you for what you clarify, but for what you refuse to justify. Explanation is weak currency. Authority is built through scarcity. I won't say this choice made me better. It made me more whole. There is a deep relief in not needing to be interpreted correctly all the time, in allowing others to be wrong about you, in not disputing every perception as if it were identity. Today I speak less, I answer less, I almost never react. And, curiously, I am listened to with more attention than ever before. If there is one thing I wish I had understood earlier, it is simple and difficult to accept. Those who truly matter do not demand explanations, and those who demand them are never satisfied by any. I'm not trying to teach anything or convince anyone. I only leave this recorded while I still have time. Stopping the need to explain myself did not make me lose space. It gave me presence back. And when you occupy your own place, the entire world adjusts its tone.